From Geppetto Studios in New Freedom, Pennsylvania, welcome to the Cosmic Geppetto Podcast, your home for inclusive, positive geek culture, where we talk about movies, comics, music, books, and whatever else we feel like. Please welcome your host.
I'm the best there is at what I do.
Brad Mendenhall.
Hey kids, it is episode 221 of the Cosmic Geppetto Podcast. From the Claremont run, Dr. Andrew Deman joins to talk about Chris Claremont's iconic run as writer of the Uncanny X-Men. This show has been loading up on Canadian doctors recently. Weird. Anywho, I have something to ask our listeners. Fan favorite Thaddeus Howes can use your help. The global pandemic has hit his family hard. Like many, it has been difficult for him to make his living over the last year. He is in danger of losing his home. Friends and fans of The Answer Man have begun a GoFundMe to help, and the response has been fantastic. It would be very cool if those who have enjoyed his contributions to the Cosmic Geppetto Podcast could donate. I know many of you have also been hit by hard times, but if you can help, it would be appreciated. The URL for the GoFundMe can be found on our Facebook page. Thank you. Very excited to have with us from the University of Waterloo and from the Claremont Run Project, Dr. J. Andrew Deman.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
Doctor, how are you doing today?
I'm pretty good. We're end of term, so my life is grading right now. So doing anything other than grading is really delightful to me.
How many classes do you teach? It's been a while since I was in a university setting, and I don't even think about how overrun you are with students and papers to grade and everything.
I got 3 classes this term, in part because I have a weird union thing where I have to take 4 months off in the summer. So they had to assign me extra class. I can't even explain it, but it results in me having a 4-month summer, which is kind of awesome because I don't think I've had 2 weeks consecutively off in a decade. So that'll be nice.
What's that 4 months off going to look like? Do you have a big project? Well, I know you already have a bunch of projects going on, and the work you've been doing with Claremont Run seems impressive enough, but do you have a thing that you're specifically looking forward to doing with that 4 months?
Yeah, I think I want to scale the project a little bit because in February we'll have the first manuscript due to go out to peer review. So I'll be kind of just sitting around not doing much. And I've been on this project forever. So new directions, I guess. I'll spend some of that 4 months trying to figure out what to do. Obviously, I really want to talk about New Mutants and Excalibur and expand the project in those directions. And probably something else, something other, something comics-y, but probably not X-Men.
Outside of X-Men, who's your favorite?
Outside of the comics in general, I'm a Hellboy fan. I'm that's a lame, easy answer.
You think that, but people who are in comics know Hellboy so much. But if you're not really dialed into that world, all Hellboy is 2 pretty good movies that didn't do huge box office and 1 terrible movie that nobody went to.
I'm a snob, though. I only like Hellboy when Mignola draws him. And there's some really talented other people who have drawn Hellboy, and I kind of don't feel it at all.
And it is his own character. And Mike Mignola, who's my favorite comic book artist.
Oh, he's so good.
He's so good. He's so different.
It's just beautiful.
Hellboy is with the crazy designs and the creatures and everything, and it's perfect for his style. Also, really smart stories, the way they would take all these different creatures and legends from different cultures and work them into the stories is so good.
His timing is supernatural. Just the way his story unfolds and the way he can pace it and fill a silence. It's just I find myself staring at it. It has that hypnotic effect that I don't think any other comic has for me.
Let's talk about Claremont Run. Give a thumbnail sketch to our listeners who may not have had a chance to happen upon it yet. What is Claremont Run?
Okay, so Claremont Run is my weird academic experiment. It was a situation where I got a promotion, and for the first time ever, I had like good research funding available, and I had a weekend to figure out what I wanted to do with that research funding. So I was like, I love Claremont. I should do something with Claremont. And I went to my chair thinking my chair was going to shoot it down immediately, and I had a list of reasons why she should let me do it. And as soon as I started talking about it, she was just like, yeah, that sounds awesome. So what we do is we started with data. So it was a 3-year data mining project where I would literally hire graduate students to just go and count stuff over the course of Claremont's 16-year run on X-Men. So tell me how many times characters hug and with who. Tell me how many times a character starts a fight, how many times a character surrenders. And then we're going to count like the really like tight minutia. Give me the number of caption boxes. Give me the number of times that Cyclops gets a thought bubble compared to how many times Storm does. So we did all this data and we just gathered this massive heap of information. And then from there, we transitioned to micro-publishing, which is cool. It's wonderful. I'm giving a presentation on it later in the year where you just kind of like drip feed publishing the way you would normally write a book, but like, you know, you're doing it one Twitter thread at a time. So every day we'll publish an observation on the Claremont run, something to do with, you know, the creative process behind it, or a specific storyline, or like a chart or graph from our data set. So we do that, which is delightful and fun. And we've got a good following going now, and we get to engage with the broader X-Twitter community, which, as you know, is amazing. And then the last thing that has to come out of this, because I was shirk funded, so I had to propose like a big project outcome, is a manuscript, which will be going out for peer review in February. So not guaranteed to see the light of day, but if it does see the light of day, I would be delighted.
Does somebody have the data on how many times somebody in that run of X-Men comics, Chris Claremont, definitely the definitive or the iconic writer of the X-Men, the guy who, with help of John Byrne, John Romita Jr., Jim Lee, and some really great artists that he had along that run, but the guy who turned that from basically a C-level Marvel comic to the biggest comic book in the world. How many times during that run did somebody say a body? He loves that term.
Oh man, he has so many pet phrases. The focus totality, the outcome was never in doubt, or something like that. Yeah, no, we don't. Okay, so the reason we don't, because I'm an English major, right? So I always think language. I try not to when I'm studying comics because I worry about like getting myopic. But we had a whole portion of the project devoted to looking at the language in depth, but it depended upon optical character recognition software. We were a little misled by some people about what that software could do, because it's not good. It can't really separate comics font very effectively. So it can give you like a rough word cloudy type thing, and it can store the words that are used, but it's going to screw up at least 10% of the words. For a scholar, that's way too high a margin of error. So we had to jettison that. But that's something I really want to come back to. I'm literally waiting for Google to get better OCR. And then it'll be nothing. Like it'll be, you just scan it and you're done. And we can analyze all the language, all the repetitions. And I mean, I think the big one a lot of people want to know is how high a proportion of like text per panel did Claremont have relative to other comic scholars? But intuitively, we know a lot. He liked to write a lot.
And people don't appreciate in comics, writers want to be wordy. That's what they do. They live and die by words. And I've had opportunities where people have asked me to do a little dialogue for different little small comic projects. And you realize like your goal is to be wordy. It's like, no, you got to cut that down by 40% because otherwise you're just going to have a big word balloon, a little head in the left-hand corner.
Right.
Claremont does a good job of it's thick dialogue for comics, but still leaving room for very dynamic and very cool action stuff, or not even action stuff, just give John Byrne, John Romita Jr., whoever it is, a chance to have that great close-up on Wolverine looking intense while he's saying, I'm the best there is at what I do.
Yes, and I think the MVP of the Claremont run in terms of collaborators is Tom Orzechowski. You know what I mean? Like the letterer has so much burden when it comes to Claremont's writing of keeping pace and keeping things moving. Maybe more so than with like any elite writer in comics history, because again, Claremont writes so much. So Tom was doing some pretty amazing work under impossible circumstances.
I know now there's a lot of John Byrne towards the later part of his career started using a computer letterer.
Mm-hmm.
Back then, folks, it was hand printed. And you have to make it look so perfect and so well-sized. And if you've ever written happy birthday on a card and when you realized the happy was too big and you had to shrink the letters, it ain't easy.
No, every time.
Every time. Years, And I'm trying to think of anything comparable, any other writer who is so closely affiliated with a particular character. And, I know Peter David had a 10, 11-year run on Hulk. And you have, Eric Larson with Savage Dragon. Not to take anything away, Eric Larson, I think it's great that he had his childhood character he created and has had this long run with it. But Savage Dragon doesn't have nearly the cultural impact as X-Men. And Peter David, it was a fantastic run, but a lot of what Peter David was trying to do is I want to tell Hulk stories that aren't like your old Hulk stories. So then now when you see Hulk in cartoons, movies, what have you, they're still sort of going back to that original Stan Lee version of the character. A little bit now with Endgame when they had the smart Hulk. It's that's sort of a Peter David thing.
Yeah, and everybody hated that, which is kind of weird. I didn't have a problem with it, but I thought it was funny that they leaned into David and everybody was mad. I think it was because he was wearing sweaters or something.
There's so many Avengers, and it's really Thor, Iron Man, Captain America. There's only so much room for Hulk when they're also trying to introduce Captain Marvel and get Spider-Man in there. It's okay, well, we're just going to have a cool visual joke that's a little different than what there has been, but he was only going to get so much screen time.
Yeah, and because of the budget, right? The Hulk was a huge portion of the Avengers budget. Because of the budget, if you're going to spend money on the Hulk, it's not going to be sitting in a cafe, typically, right? You'd want to have that money for some big smashing alien fight as they did in the first Avengers. If you're doing a group film like that, I think the Hulk inevitably gets sidelined in terms of things like character development. So I thought it was cool that they were trying to do something with them.
Well, also, Marvel has a lot of long game thinking. And I know the rights for Hulk are a little jumbled. There might be a plan. It's okay, this is where we're going now, and he's going to be a big part of the next Thor or whatever. He can pop up anywhere. Then they'll really tell the rest of the story. Are there any other writers, aside from Stan Lee, who's just associated with everything Marvel, but any other writer that's so closely tied into a series or a set of characters?
Well, in terms of like Marvel and DC, not really. I think you have to go outside a little bit. You have to go to Dave Sim on Cerebus, where you again see a writer kind of crafting a character. And Sim has that advantage that he created Cerebus from scratch, right? That's his character. For me, one of the things that makes Claremont's work so kind of compelling is exactly what you said. He came into a C-list title. And he looked at all this stuff, some of it a little problematic, quite frankly, and spun gold out of it. Slowly but surely built up those characters to a beloved status, even though he doesn't get credit for creating them, which is weird, because I would argue Claremont did create Wolverine. I would argue he did create Storm and Nightcrawler. But as we know, the legal system can't really keep up with that kind of ambiguity in creators' rights.
The people aren't familiar. X-Men have been around for a while, and it was Cyclops, Jean Grey, Iceman, Beast, and Angel, with very, very little turnover. And it wasn't very successful. It wasn't very popular. And for a while, they stopped creating new stories. Uncanny X-Men was just a reprint series.
I always teach this to my students as, imagine if you're sitting in front of your TV and the season premiere for Game of Thrones is on for season 7, and it's just season 2 over again. You would die. You'd be killed for that kind of thing. No one cared about X-Men at the time. This is a book that had Stan Lee, Jack Kirby, Neil Adams, Roy Thomas, like some legends on it. And when they start reprinting X-Men comics with the Essential line and stuff like that, they literally skip those guys and go straight to Claremont's. Because that was for a lot of people where X-Men began.
And it was sort of weird. First off, that wouldn't happen anymore. They wouldn't keep a series around that long that's just reprints. They would just cancel it because they cancel everything.
Yeah.
Do you know why they decided to sort of revitalize it and give a new creative team a chance with completely new characters? They kept Cyclops, and that was it. And an all-new character. Well, some characters have been around in other aspects, but new to being X-Men.
Yeah, it's a weird story. The first part of it, they brought Neil Adams in towards the end of the first X-Men run. Unfortunately, they didn't have the means to track the success of the book very quickly. So the Neil Adams run, they learned after Neil Adams had left and they had canceled the book, was actually pretty successful. And it started a revitalization. So I think on the one hand, there was that sense of a missed opportunity. And then the big thing was Marvel was in the 1970s trying to crack into the international market where they were, just selling reprints, but they figured these reprints would sell a lot better if we were doing like original stories with international heroes. So that was the mandate that they went to Len Wein with. Give me a story about international superheroes. So Wein said, okay, well, there's been some fan demand to revitalize X-Men. Let's just do that. And they did. And by all accounts, it worked. So, I mean, one of the real footholds for X-Men first was just breaking that international market. And that success eventually translated, of course, to domestic success as well.
That new group, it was very international. So you had Storm, who was an African character. You had our friend Anna Peppard, who was just on. Her favorite, Nightcrawler, who was German. Wolverine, who, international to me, not so much to you, Canadian. And Sunfire, who an Asian character, which, by the way, you could see it very easily not working because it would just look like a weird set of tokenism.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, we're just going to pick one from each group and not worry of knowing whether they're going to fit together. Also Colossus Russian.
Yeah, Banshee from Ireland.
Also, some of these characters a little stereotypical. So,
oh yeah,
Banshee, basically a walking clover leaf. When they restarted, it was bi-monthly for quite a while. Like they weren't even all in for quite a bit.
Yeah, exactly. It took some time for them to really develop confidence in it, even though they were getting a little bit of tension at first. Like I think if you look at the letters page, people were kind of mad that the X-Men got rid of Iceman and Angel and Beast, and not really Jean, but some people still kind of felt like she was gone. Claremont describes it as really empowering. Like I talked to him in an interview, and he says the best thing that happened to us, as in him and Dave Cockrum, was that nobody cared. And because nobody cared, they could do whatever they wanted. And if you look at the first major arc that he put in, the Phoenix Saga, you're talking about a 30-issue story arc that undermines really key principles in terms of things that Marvel was doing at the time, including with female characters. That old idea of when you give an artist space, they can do really cool stuff. And then the trade-off was once they gave him that space, he did really cool stuff, became the best-selling book at Marvel for a very long time. And that, in turn, gave him more space, gave him power, right?
Well, I was going to ask about that because something that John Byrne, who likes saying what he's thinking, good for him.
It's a good way to say it.
One thing that John Byrne has complained about was they started dealing with more editor interference the more popular they got. And what is it? And I'm going to butcher the expression, but success has many fathers and failure is an orphan.
Mm-hmm.
It was a thing where nobody cared what they did with X-Men when it wasn't successful, but as soon as it was successful, that every editor, assistant editor, VP, whatever, all of a sudden they wanted to have their finger in X-Men and start throwing out their opinions on what can and cannot happen. And Byrne would grumble, it's like, this was the best-selling comic there was, and we were getting awards, and it was an acclaimed run. Why don't you spend more effort tinkering with A Man Called Nova or whatever poor-selling comic with an interesting character and revitalize those like we did X-Men, which completely makes sense. I always got the feeling that Claremont was a little better navigating that than Byrne, because Byrne's, he's a little crotchety.
Yeah, I think, Claremont has a reputation as a company man, which is pretty well documented. Sean Howe's great book on Marvel Comics talks about how, at the time, the thing was you would bounce back and forth between company in order to get your price to go up. So you would leverage DC against Marvel and then Marvel against DC. And we know this with all the creators in that era, right? Everybody's going back and forth. Claremont never did. He did eventually write for DC once Marvel kicked him out, but he just wanted to write his characters. He was happy writing his characters. He even gave up money to his artists just to kind of, get the right artists, the ones that he wanted. So he was in it for the love, which I think is really kind of fun. Like in comics, you get a little bit of that, but people with that kind of fierce artistic integrity that he was known for. The only other one I can think of on that level is like Bill Watterson of Calvin and Hobbes. That's kind of cool, right? And what you're describing is kind of how his run ended, which was Bob Harris had the best-selling comic in the world at the time through X-Men, but wanted to tinker with it, wanted to put his stamp on it, reinvent it as something for a younger generation using dynamic visual artists and choosing their side over the writer. And that's what eventually led to him being pushed out.
Yeah, to people who aren't familiar, I think the record still holds, and it's not going to be broken. The first issue of X-Men is different than Uncanny X-Men. They decided to have a second series, X-Men, and it was drawn by Jim Lee, who was an amazing artist and supremely popular, and comics were at their real peak of people buying comics and buying them and just keeping them in a bag, so they're planning on selling them 20 years later to put their kids through college.
Yes.
Which is a whole other thing.
Not a brilliant strategy, as it turned out.
No, people, if you've heard the Beanie Babies story, it's the same thing. And it had 5 different covers, the first issue, and it sold 7 million copies, if my memory is right on that.
There's different accounts. We'll never know the official because how comics were sold in this era, like how many of those actually found their way to buyers as opposed to just comic stores. But yeah, it holds the Guinness World Record for the best-selling single-issue comic of all time. And that was his severance package. Was he said, like, what he wanted for his severance was, let me write the first arc of the new X-Men. So he did. And it's actually a pretty good arc, considering.
It was a pretty good arc. By that point, Lee was co-plotter.
I believe he kept his hands off that final arc. I think that was the agreement. After that, Lee became plotter. And I think Byrne came back to do dialogue for a few times, but he got frustrated working with the younger artists.
That was pretty much the end of my really deep, gotta buy every issue of X-Men was that run. First off, because you had 2 series running at the same time, and X-Men, like every, not just comic book, but every serialized piece of entertainment, they have their tried and true things they go back to. With X-Men, it would always be a thing of, you would always have this really impressive bad guy that would show up, and they would always capture the X-Men, and then it was like, okay, how are they going to escape? And I remember after that initial run, like the second arc, the X-Men got captured 3 times in 2 issues. I was like, okay, guys, let's find... It's like, come on, you got captured at the beginning of the episode, you got rescued at the middle of the episode, and by the end of the issue, you got captured again. This is only a 22-page comic. Let's try something a little different. And you could also see that there were new characters created that it felt like they started with the visuals and worked their way down, as opposed to Claremont, a lot of those characters he created, it was like creating a unique backstory and power set, and then going from there.
Yeah, absolutely. He's a character first writer, and he understood that. I mean, if you look at him historically, I mean, I've been saying all these nice things about him because that's kind of my job. In terms of plots, he's not that talented. He's not great at creating original stories. He borrows, and that's not the worst thing in the world. Like that's also William Shakespeare, who doesn't create original stories at all. He just borrows them, or they don't make any sense, like The Tempest. So Shakespeare's plotting ability isn't really there. And that's why a lot of people, like I've read a few comic scholars talk about how the Byrne collaboration was so good because Byrne forced plot on Claremont, sort of like resolution and stories that actually end. But I mean, me personally, I really like the stories that didn't. I like the way that the arcs kind of meandered all over the place and became unpredictable. And then fundamentally, again, just that it wasn't about the story. It was always about the character. For me, that was really interesting.
Well, you talk about Dark Phoenix. Dark Phoenix was a very finite story that had a beginning, middle, end. Then later you would get to the thing. I remember, what were the alien knockoffs they did? The Brood?
There were a few alien knockoffs they did. But yes, the Brood was the big one.
The Brood was the big one. And I remember, and that was, what was it? Alan Silvestri was drawing that.
Paul Smith and Dave Cockrum a little bit, actually, too.
Well, I'm thinking more of a little bit later one. It's when they were
Broodfall. That was Mark Silvestri. That's a great arc.
Mark Silvestri. Alan Silvestri is the guy. He does scores for movies.
Oh, okay, that sounds right.
Mark Silvestri drew it, and I remember it showed that the Brood had come to Earth.
Yes.
Havoc and Polaris found out that the shark spaceships that they flew. They found that, and they realized, like, oh my God, the Brood are here. And it was like a big dun 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 end of an issue. The next issue, Havoc sort of hung out with the X-Men, then he joined the X-Men, and then it was a year and a half later that they finally came back to that.
Yep.
It was fine, but I remember reading every issue, and it was such a great cliffhanger. I was excited. It's like, oh, they're going to fight the Brood. And the earlier stories with the Brood had happened before I got into X-Men. So I wasn't real familiar with their backstory, and that was before Wikipedia. You could find out everything you need to know real quick. So I was like really excited. I was like, what's going to happen? And on every issue was like, wasn't this a big deal? They seemed really worried about it. And then finally, a year and a half later, they came back to it. So there was pacing stuff that they would even make fun of X-Men for that. It's like, oh, there's going to be a plot line. Don't worry, it's a mutant book. They'll deal with it in 5 years.
Dangling plot threads. That's another thing he's known for sure.
He never told the story of Wolverine's origin.
No, he didn't want to, though. He thought it was better as a mystery.
Yeah. I want your take on this, because my take is I get it. They have told Wolverine's origin and nobody cared.
Oh.
As opposed to Spider-Man, every 2 years they want to retell it or find an interesting hook to that. And obviously with every movie with Spider-Man, they retell the origin. And Wolverine, they had that 6-issue miniseries where you finally found out his name and you found out his origin. That was 10 minutes of the Wolverine origin movies, and then they never touched it again because it wasn't particularly interesting, or it's not a good origin.
Right.
But my thought is Claremont was writing like he was going to write these characters forever. And it made sense. It's like the character's better as a mystery, and we should never tell the story. And then eventually, after he left the series, we're going to tell the origin. I get where he's coming from, but on the other hand, it would have been better. It could have been better for him to finally tell the story instead of someone else coming in and screwing it up.
Yeah, sure. As a way to sort of stake a claim of ownership over the character to some degree. Yeah, I can agree with that. That makes a lot of sense. I do agree, though, that I think Wolverine works better if you don't know his origin.
Yeah. Again, we never talk about his origin. Everyone knows it. He knows it. And in the comics, they never talk about it. And it does really take something away from the character, because if you're not going to give him a good origin story, don't do it. There was a lot of money to be made telling that story.
Yes, for sure. I mean, the hype around Wolverine origin was pretty big, as I recall, right? People were excited that this was finally going to be resolved once and for all after all these years of retcons and fake memories and all that stuff.
They were, and they had a pretty good creative team behind it. I think they really just blew it when they named him Jim Howlett. I was like, oh.
I also have questions about why there's a mansion in the Yukon, because that's not really a thing. But all right.
It'd be like if it turns out Spider-Man's real name was Peter Arachnia. I was like, oh, okay.
Yeah.
And I'm a big believer that really good comic book origins, the first Spider-Man comic, The Amazing Stories 15, that was only a 11-page story in another comic. And Superman has a really concise origin. Batman does. It's like, it was so big and convoluted, and it was all over the place. And it's like, right.
We associate origin stories with kind of being an iconic element of a character that defines their trajectory forward. And having Wolverine not have that maybe makes him a little like rudderless potentially. Where we're like, what exactly is he seeking? What kind of atonement or, again, resolution? Yeah, I think that feeds into a lot of kind of comics tradition.
You're on Chris Claremont's radar. You've talked with him. How much familiarity does he have with what you're doing with Claremont, Ron?
So I've interviewed him. I send regular updates to his wife / agent, just saying, hey, here's what we did in the last 6 months, and they're pretty delightful. He has popped up on our Twitter run occasionally, which is terrifying to me, to be perfectly honest, where you're like talking about someone's work and they're like, yep, that's what I was doing.
That I went through your Twitter, I saw that, and it's not like he doesn't have the blue check mark or anything.
No, but he writes like Claremont. I mean, we could all be being catfished, but yeah, no.
It feels like him, and you're in context, so you have a better idea of that than anyone else. But so he likes what you're doing?
Yeah, I think so. When I talked to him, when I first proposed the project, I think he was a little, all right, good luck to you. Trying to explain to him that I'm tackling his work from an academic perspective with the central thesis that this work had an enormous impact on the way that we currently tell stories in media. Like our project has been drawing all kinds of connections between like Claremont's specific writing style and what's called binge watching, as you know, just the way that the stories are structured. And like we have a really direct through line. Like Joss Whedon has always said that he writes as a comic writer. And he always says that Claremont is his biggest influence, and that Buffy the Vampire Slayer, which is credited as sort of like the TV show that defined how to do sort of long continuity storytelling on television. There's a clear line there. I wrote an article about it, and Neil Gaiman actually saw it and like retweeted it and agreed with me. And yeah, that I think that his words were that Claremont's fingerprints are all over contemporary television. And I think we're really seeing that in contemporary television, this idea that it's this new medium, right? And we need to figure out how to tell our stories without making them these condensed 48-minute things. A generation was raised on X-Men comics, and a lot of those people became writers. So they've brought that into a contemporary media landscape.
Well, I remember when Whedon did that run on
Astonishing.
Astonishing X-Men, and I love that run.
Yeah, it was a good run.
And it felt very Claremont, and it's tough because there's been a lot of other writers who've had perfectly solid runs on X-Men, but it was the first time where it felt like, oh, he's writing Claremont X-Men stories.
Yeah.
And that was a little tighter because it was obvious that Claremont had like a 24, 36, however many issues he wrote. He had like a beginning, middle, and end, and then he was going to walk away because it's Joss Whedon. He had other stuff to do.
That's right. Money to make.
If you're about ready to direct the biggest movie in the world, probably writing X-Men isn't going to have the same financial incentives.
No, he talked about that.
I can certainly think of bad X-Men runs, Chuck Austin. I remember when they did that run of X-Men that he did, and it was just so bad. It was all the worst parts of Chris Claremont, and then also just sort of gross writing. Yeah,
and characters just doing anything, like no character consistency whatsoever. It was hard to read.
What other writers post Claremont have had the best runs?
Okay, I don't hate the Bendis run, and I know a lot of people do. But I think Bendis was trying to do some cool character reflection stuff with the time-displaced X-Men. He just kept them around too long. I think Matt Rosenberg, who again took a whole lot of guff for what in my mind was editorial interference more than anything, forcing all these crossovers on him, was doing some cool kind of Claremontian stuff as well. From the contemporary pack, I think Leah Williams is a really gifted character-oriented writer. So I'm kind of hoping they give her the reins to the main book and a long run there as well to see what she can do. Hickman is not a Claremontian writer at all, but I like that he's doing something new. It's a plot-oriented X-Men comic, right? We haven't really had that for a very long time. Yeah, I think those are the ones that kind of stand out to me.
Well, it was interesting with Bendis because Bendis, first off, I think he was getting towards the end of his Marvel time.
Yeah.
He sort of touched on all the characters. He did some really cool stuff. I loved especially the early run on Ultimate Spider-Man.
Yes. Wow. And that's another long run too there, right?
Yeah. What was it they loved announcing that went specifically that he and Mark Bagley broke the Lee Kirby record on Fantastic Four for longest team to work on the same character.
That's awesome.
It was really great stuff. And he was able to tell some stories. He was able to do some really gutsy stuff because editorial gave him some free reign. But by the time he got to that, and it was a neat idea. It felt like a neat miniseries idea. It's like, okay, we're going to take the time displaced original X-Men, bring them to the current times, and tinker around with their dynamic. So that sounds great. It doesn't feel like an X-Men story. It almost feels like a neat miniseries to the side or whatever.
Yeah.
But I think just by that point, it was almost getting time for Bendis to go to a different toy box. I think it's hard for a comic book writer to stay in one company with one group. That's what makes Claremont and Peter David so impressive, because they're really, no matter how much you associate characters with them, they're still playing with borrowed toys. Because the guy who did The Walking Dead, Kirkman did Spider-Man, he did Marvel stuff, he did DC stuff, and then after a while, it's like lost his passion for it, and also realized he could make a ton of money with Walking Dead.
He's not hurting.
So it felt like Bendis had done all that he could do with Marvel, and people were also sort of like, Claremont has his things. Bendis also has his things. He's very good at certain things, and he's not so great at others. Bendis isn't great at his climaxes.
As evident by like his last issue on X-Men, which is an intervention. It was weird.
And, Bendis has done some really cool stuff at DC since then, because he got a chance to sort of take what he does well and then apply that to Superman, Wonder Woman, Batman, these iconic characters who function differently than X-Men, Spider-Man, whoever, and can do some interesting stuff with that. Although I know that's been met with differing opinions.
For sure.
That's who Bendis is. You can't be the biggest writer in comics and not have a lot of people dislike what you're doing.
That polarizing effect. He's in that boat. I find the writers that everybody loves usually are kind of boring crowd pleasers.
Dave Sims. It's very easy for everyone to like what you do when you're doing something very personal and that you own. And if you don't like it, you can go away. No one compares Cerebus to the Lee version of the character. So whenever you do X-Men, you're going to be compared to Claremont and, maybe Bendis or maybe some of those other popular runs. That's tough.
One of the things that we published on there's the Twitter thread, was there's a really good letter page in Uncanny X-Men shortly after the Dark Phoenix saga, talking about the Dark Phoenix saga, where a fan wrote in about how this is a perversion of everything X-Men represented. And you've ruined these characters, you've killed them, and I'll never buy an X-Men comic. And it was Kurt Busiek. Which is kind of fun.
Has Busiek talked about that since?
So somebody, because I posted this on the Twitter thread, somebody tagged Busiek and he came in and started shouting at people.
Oh, wow.
I'm used to being an academic where I'm in like a room and the creators are not anywhere near me. So having people interface in Twitter has been this weird experience. Like, it's cool. I remember trying to explain to my dean who Neil Gaiman was. That was fun. Just like the best-selling author on the planet. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, he's been on The Simpsons. He has some cultural saturation.
He wrote a book on Duran Duran.
He did?
That was his first publication, yeah.
He's had a wild existence.
Oh, he's amazing.
Who would you consider to be the big artist that you associate with Claremont? Of course, you have John Byrne, Mark Silvestri, John Romita Jr., and who am I missing? Jim Lee.
Cockrum, JR, I think he said. For me, Paul Smith. I think he did 11 issues, if that, but left an indelible mark. And he's the one, I think his particular visual capacity to represent like nuanced character emotion, I think that's what encouraged Claremont to turn in that direction after Byrne had left and after the second Cockrum run. And to me, that's when X-Men gets really good. So even though Smith wasn't there for too long, I kind of associate him as my iconic Claremont penciler. But I mean, I love Silvestri. Silvestri's work is beautiful and gritty in a way that I thought was really cool. And Jim Lee was, I think, my first X-Men illustrator I ever read. And just the dynamism visually with every panel looking like it could be a poster was really cool to see as well.
What I liked about Smith is he drew that great fight between Wolverine and Silver Samurai.
Yes, that's right.
Artists, they like to draw Wolverine where him jumping into a crowd of ninjas or gangsters or whatever, they're shooting at him and he's yelling and he's just swiping his claws like these big haymakers. And I bet it's one of those things I'm sure it's really fun to draw. But what Smith did, and the only other artist I've ever seen do it as well, is Frank Miller.
I was going to say, yeah.
It's a really well choreographed fight, and you can sort of see the chess game between the opponents.
Yeah, you can see what's happening, right? Like you get a sense of that sort of spatial awareness of how that choreography is unfolding.
Silvestri, really good artist. You can't take anything away from, this is a wildly successful artist. He was one of the guys who made Image Comics happen. And I think Silvestri's work has aged really well, where some of those other Image guys, not so much.
Are we thinking Liefeld?
Liefeld has aged terrible. Even McFarlane, and I love McFarlane. I reread some of the stuff as like, ooh, this hasn't aged well.
Yeah. Not
that it's bad, but the seams show a little bit. But Silvestri, really cool, but he was really into that scene of whenever you would see Wolverine in battle, it was like 20 guys hanging off of Wolverine, and then he was like swiping through and sending people flying. And it's very Jack Kirby, which is great, but I always liked more of like tighter fight sequences. Even what was it, the Wolverine and Kitty Pryde miniseries?
Yeah, was that John Buscema?
Al Milgrom.
Okay.
I'm not a big Al Milgrom fan, but Milgrom was able to it had like really neat choreography. I didn't love Milgrom's work when everyone was sitting around talking because it wasn't very smooth art, but he was able to sort of piece together a neat fight sequence. and not everyone does.
Yeah, I think that comes down to like visual storytelling. Like a lot of these great visual artists who are wildly popular, they can't really advance a story very effectively. You know what I mean? Like there's two different skills there, and one of them is really obvious and we can speak to it effectively, and the other is a subtle art and requires talented people who've put a lot of thought into their draftsmanship. I kind of agree. I think a lot of the image revolution was based around, again, images where every panel looks like a poster. And that's an aesthetic. That's wonderful. Like you can stare at it for hours, but does it always tell the story effectively? I don't know. Sometimes, I mean, some can, some in my mind can't.
Jim Lee, what you said, every panel that Jim Lee drew looked like a poster. That's great. And he could do some neat action stuff. And especially, you could also tell who Lee liked better.
Yes, sir.
Jim Lee liked drawing Wolverine, snarling and lunging. But it seemed like he was more interested in drawing Gambit because his Gambit stuff was really cool.
Yes, that's true.
Speaking of Gambit, who are your favorite X-Men? And first off, like your favorite character, and then your favorite team.
Okay, so Storm, because Storm is amazing, and if you like start to really track the actual structural movements in X-Men when they have kind of structural advancements, it's all around Storm. It's all around her development as a character, and the X-Men kind of go with her, right? So yeah, no, this idea of this character who is a goddess but also a woman, that really shows in how later writers have been unable to represent that duality, where Storm becomes a kind of boring goddess character in the hands of a lot of people, which is unfortunate. So she's probably my favorite character. In terms of team, I'm a sucker for the Outback era.
I was going to say the same thing. I love that team.
And like, it's such a scattershot team, like ragtag, put together people who don't really want to be there and don't have that sense of mission or purpose. And it's certainly not a school, and it's not like a rich mansion. They're in this gritty desert. And I really like Madeline Pryor, and I love the build up to Inferno, including Broodfall, which you mentioned. Yeah, that's my era, I think.
Yeah, the people aren't familiar, and the story was really wacky. The X-Men, and the team was falling apart. Kitty Pryde and Nightcrawler were injured and eventually spun off into Excalibur, that comic. Cyclops had left the team, and he had gone on to form X-Factor. So it was Storm, Wolverine, Rogue, who had been mainstays for a while, Colossus, who had just rejoined the team, and then Dazzler. And Dazzler had been in a solo comic. She was a 70s disco queen, and they were trying to sort of modernize the character. Longshot, who had a great miniseries by Art Adams and Ann Nesenti. And Havoc, who was, you mentioned before, Havoc, that was Cyclops' screw-up younger brother.
I love that dynamic so much.
It was nice because Havoc was something that you don't see a lot in comics. He wasn't very good at being a hero.
No.
With Wolverine, Spider-Man, Batman, normally they overcome the pain and they stand up and they fight off and they fight back. Havoc was the guy who's like, okay, he can't stand the pain, so he's just going to lay down and pass out. And
make terrible relationship choices.
So all those characters died, but then because they reset the cosmic balance of the cosmic universe, were brought back and were given a place in Australia to hide and like basically do stealth missions where everyone thought they were dead. And what was it? Cameras couldn't see them?
That's correct. Yeah. Roma, who is Merlin's daughter, gave them that gift to allow them to be a stealthy strike force.
Eventually they just gave up on that.
Yes, they did. Well, they fell apart hard. Storm seemingly died. Wolverine left them. Rogue seemingly died. So it was like 4 of them at the end. And the Reavers were going to ambush them and take the base back. So they passed through a magic amulet that dispersed them to the far corners of the globe and gave them new identities.
And that had Longshot in it. And Longshot it was weird because Longshot had never been presented as a mutant, but I guess it was just a thing of Claremont liked the character.
Oh, totally. Yeah.
And his powers were whenever he was trying to do good stuff, he was really lucky.
Yes.
It had a really cool look. It was a look that was a little dated because it was pretty much a mullet.
Yep. Beautiful mullet.
Beautiful mullet. And it was funny because he was a character that everyone really liked. They brought him into X-Men. So they brought this new character that was really well liked. They brought him into the most popular comic. He was there for a few years, and then they just sort of wrote him off.
Off panel, too.
and nobody else has really done anything. I know he pops up every now and then. I think he even had like a run in the X Factor that Peter David wrote.
Yep, his return to X Factor, yeah.
It hasn't had a big run since. It's like, it was weird. It'd be like if Cable, after a 2-year run, you never saw him again. A buzzy character that just disappeared. It's like, that's always struck me as a missed opportunity, because Marvel has had a tough time, and DC's the same. Haven't had the easiest times of getting a lot of fan interest in new characters. So you always think like, nobody can pick up and try to create a new series with him. You know, there's been a lot of movies with X-Men characters. New Mutants came out and nobody cared just recently.
I cared. It was just bad.
Do you have a favorite X-Men movie related, be it Deadpool, New Mutants? Of course not. Or going into the animation, which there have been a lot of different versions of. Do you have a favorite? Do you have one that you think got it really right?
Well, my theory is that the movies are good movies. I don't have a problem with the movies. Okay, not all of them are good movies, but some of them are good movies. I liked First Class. I liked X1 and X2 within limits. But for me, I think the problem is that X-Men being so character focused and such a long game story, I think it kind of needs to be a TV series. Do you know what I mean? Like, I don't think a movie can do it. It can't juggle that many characters and do anything with them in 2 hours and 10 minutes or whatever they get. So I think the animated series excel by virtue of like that, being able to lay things out and slow burn develop stuff. That to me is what X-Men is. And they've all been pretty good. Like the original animated series, Evolution, Wolverine and the X-Men, which unfortunately didn't get as long a run as most would have liked due to Marvel shenanigans. In the future, with what's going on with the Disney acquisition and all that kind of stuff, I really hope they put together a prestige X-Men TV series. So sort of Gifted, which was an underrated series in my mind, but with the advantage of prestige television format versus broadcast television format, which I think will allow them to do more X-Men-ish stuff.
Yeah, and they'll have the chance to, because Gifted and Legion danced around their association with Marvel. They would mention Professor X or something like that, but it'd be great if they could have something like this where, okay, let's put on Disney Plus and actually have Wolverine in it. Have that name actor playing Wolverine, and then, of course, they'll go off into his movie because Wolverine's going to be too big a character to just contain on a TV show. Which is
the curse of Wolverine, right? He's too popular. You got to use him everywhere.
Wolverine and Spider-Man, they're going to be in every comic.
And Deadpool.
Yeah, because there's been a Deadpool Spider-Man series that's been running on and off for years, and it's like those characters don't really mesh well, but they have really successful movie franchises behind both of them, so do it, I guess. It's funny, you mentioned New Mutants. It's been a while, but Bob McLeod, who co-created New Mutants and was the original artist on it, he was nice enough to come on the show many moons ago. And when he came on, they were about to start filming New Mutants. I remember he expressed some frustration with Sunspot had been in Days of Future Past. And he co-created that character, but because it wasn't a New Mutants movie, there was not financial compensation for it. And I was like, oh, well, if New Mutants happens, are they going to cut you a check? It's like, yeah, if they ever make it. So I want to follow up. Is like, I don't want to speak for him. I can't imagine he was in love with that movie, and also definitely not in love with the fact that there's not going to be a second one. But I hope he got a good check out of that.
Me too. And Sinkovitz, man, like he deserves a check too.
Yeah, because basically it was just a really bad version of really cool stuff that he did.
Man, it contradicted a lot of what that classic story arc was about. I found it kind of frustrating. The Demon Bear isn't about like coming to terms with your own inner anger or something like that. So you're kind of spinning things in a weird direction. You're making characters entirely different from how they were, and their dynamic entirely different from how they were. I was really excited to see those characters on the screen, and they weren't the characters that I knew. So you just feel kind of cheated as a fan.
The idea was, we're not going to make another X-Men movie, and we're not going to make something else that's Marvel. They were going to make a horror movie that happened to be based on a superhero property. And it made sense because there's so many Marvel movies and then so many DC movies, and X-Men is sort of a franchise that's running out of gas. Deadpool was able to do something crazy where it was a breaking the fourth wall R-rated comedy. So that worked. But I think that it would have worked better if, and I'm thinking of Big Hero 6 where they do a Disney animated movie and they just took a really little known Marvel property and tweak it to make it fit. Like maybe if it had been...
Sorry, do we know that Big Hero 6 was also created by Claremont?
Oh, gosh, you're right.
Sorry, I just had to mention that for continuity. Yeah, no, I love Big Hero 6.
That was such a good movie, and if people aren't familiar, Big Hero 6 was like a limited series. It never got a lot of traction, but it was a Marvel comic. They really threw everything out, except for a couple names.
Oh, yeah. It's an overhaul for sure.
But it worked. And remember the miniseries Fallen Angels that had a couple of New Mutants?
Yes, beloved miniseries with a lobster in it.
You could have done that, like turn that into a horror franchise rather than New Mutants, which is too much of a known property. And if you mess too much with the characters, it ends up not satisfying anyone. Because the people who love New Mutants, the comics, they're going to be unhappy. And the people who don't know it, then it's just a mediocre horror movie.
Yeah, I think, again, that idea of just creative freedom and what it does. It's where X-Men came from. It's where Miller's Daredevil came from. Just nobody cares, so I can do what I want. And that gives you that kind of space to work once again, as with Big Hero 6, in a way that you're not going to get with like the next Spider-Man animated series.
And I love Spider-Man. Spider-Man's my favorite character, but that's why I was really excited by the Miles Morales Spider-Man.
Oh, man.
I've always liked when they've had like the Ben Reilly Scarlet Spider. I was like, okay, there you can tell Spider-Man stories that aren't weighed down by 70 years of Peter Parker stories.
Yeah, Spider-Gwen, you can do the same thing. Like you can pick up on these themes and you can give them a new light rather than just kind of recycling the same ideas over and over again. The way that, sometimes Sony has done with the Spider franchise before they lost the rights to it. Not exactly.
Marvel has the rights back to X-Men. You mentioned it'd be nice for there to be like a Disney Plus prestige X-Men related story. What do you think's going to happen?
I think they're going to do a film franchise. I think, well, I mean, mind you, with the pandemic, who knows, right? They might start to see that as not the best business model, depending on what the new normal looks like. But yeah, that has seemed to have been their plan for a while. They'll do a gradual launch. And then they'll do probably an introduction of Wolverine first, I would think, followed by eventually an X-Men franchise story. I believe Rogue is supposed to now be in the next Ms. Marvel movie. That'd be interesting. I mean, that's maybe the nice thing is that Disney does have the money that they can play the long game in a cinematic universe.
They don't need X-Men right away. And I could see that Rogue could be the way to do it because Rogue has been in the comics a foil for Captain Marvel or Ms. Marvel back in the day. Have her show up as sort of one of these reluctant bad guys in Captain Marvel 2, and at the end is like, well, we think we know people that can help her, and that could be the first like little find a way to get that world in there, which I know isn't going to be easy because mutants have been around forever in Marvel's comic book universe, and trying to explain is like, hey, where have all these people been?
And I think that reflects kind of the Marvel's treatment of the X-Men in the comics universe. They've always been kind of siloed, right? The X universe has been its own thing for the most part. You'll see crossovers here and there with like Thor or the Avengers, but they kind of like to have the X-Men stories operate independently. Would a cinematic universe do that? I don't know.
They have people that are paid a lot of money to do it. I'm sure they'll figure a way. But yeah, in the comics, they had very few crossovers. It would be more of Spider-Man looking into the sky and his spider sense tingling because Dark Phoenix is coming to Earth, which is great.
Yeah, that was their way to indicate that something big was happening. Give me like 6 consecutive panels of Doctor Strange and Spider-Man. I'm kind of sniffing the air for a minute.
So, Andrew, this has been fantastic. I need you to quick plug your pluggables because aside from Claremont Run, you have also been doing some great work with the 3-panel contrast with our friend Anna Papard. I've recently become familiar with the show. I love so much what you're doing because it's so smart.
Thank you.
You're taking stuff that some people see as silly or people don't understand, and you treat it very seriously, but also keeping it, but also it's well paced and it's energetic. So please tell our listeners about the 3-panel contrast.
Thank you. 3-Panel Contrast is our podcast where we have 3 scholars, myself, Anna Papard, and Michael Hancock. And each episode, we take two comics classics and we just kind of like juxtapose them a little bit, right? Just to see how they compare to each other and what they draw out from each other. And it can be anything. It can be superheroes. It can be alternative comics press. It can be like staunchly serious graphic novel-y stuff. And then other than that, I have a book chapter on Storm in Super Sex from University of Texas Press, which is available now. And then the main thing is, you can Google me. I have a bunch of like publications out there. But the main thing is the Claremont Run Twitter. And if anyone is interested in following our micro publishing once a day, say something about X-Men project, it's at Claremont Run on Twitter.
Very cool. We recommend everyone check that out. And you've had a thing where you've had some people, including our friend Travis Smith, doing dramatic readings from the Claremont Run of X-Men.
Yeah, we thought it would be a cool thing to add of just, we call them amateur unironic readings, because, you know, everybody can read Claremont ironically because he's so over the top. But we thought it'd be fun to just have people do it sincerely. Just read a passage from X-Men. We'll put some cool music behind it and a visualization. And I don't know, just kind of unabashed participation, loving Claremont's writing. It's been fun.
Travis did a great job with it. And I'm gonna put you on the spot right here. We have some very good vocal talent associated with the Cosmic Geppetto podcast. We want in.
We would love to have you.
So, so you're on the spot. We'd love to do that. And we'll talk a little bit, with the mics off. But I want to sort of embarrass you into making the offer to us because it'd be a lot of fun to do. And like I say, Travis did such a great job. And it's a great idea because you don't need to do it jokey. You don't need to be doing it ironically or having quote unquote fun with it because the dialogue's so rich and so fun. Just give a good reading and the fun will go from there.
Yes, firm offer. You guys are welcome anytime.
All right, well, Andrew, this has been awesome, and we want to have you back because we love smart people who know their comic stuff. So will you return?
Absolutely.
Okay, and this isn't going to be a Claremont thing where you don't show up for 5 years. We want you back soon.
Yes, I'll have editorial conflict, and I'll be like, screw those guys.
That wraps episode 221. Big thanks to Dr. Andrew Deman. Such a nice guy, and I'm loving the 3-panel contrast podcast and ClaremontRun.com. How does he do so much? Am I lazy? I'm lazy, right? Next time on the Cosmic Geppetto podcast. This is a big one. Joining me will be one of my all-time favorites. In my opinion, the creative force behind some of the greatest rock albums ever. That's right. Matthew Sweet will be here, talking to me. My life is awesome. Until then, in the words of Jarf Hardin,
see you in the funny pages.
He says, when you gonna make up your mind? When you gonna love you as much as I do? When you gonna make up your mind? 'Cause things are gonna change so fast.
Subscribe to the Cosmic Geppetto podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever quality podcasts can be found. Rate and review us while there. Follow us on Twitter at CosmicGPod and we will follow you back. Unless you're a jerk. We don't follow jerks. Like us on Facebook at facebook.com/Cosmic Geppetto. We love hearing your ideas for upcoming episodes. Email us at cosmicgeppetto@comcast.net.
You the man. No, you the man. No, you the man. No, you the man.
Flowers competing for the sun. Years go by and I'm here still waiting, withering where some snowman was. Mirror, mirror, where's the crystal palace? waiting around the truth who I am. But I know that the ice is getting thin. When you gonna make up your mind? When you gonna love you as much as I do? When you gonna make up your mind? 'Cause things are gonna change so fast. All the white horses are still in bed. I tell you that I'll always want you near. You say that things change, my dear. Hair is gray and the fires are burning. So many dreams on the shelf. You say I wanted you to be proud of me. I always wanted that myself. When you gonna make up your mind? When you gonna love you as much as I do? When you gonna make up your mind? 'Cause things are gonna change so fast. All the white horses have gone ahead. I tell